Best practices for network excellence have evolved, driven by the increased focus on the digital experience as the primary revenue driver for enterprises. Now, as a result, IT leaders face a mandate to enhance performance, cut costs, and ensure security across network, cloud, and internet environments. But what are the implications of these trends on network teams? And how can network engineering and architecture teams gain support and buy-in throughout their organizations to support this network transformation? Hi, everybody. My name is Jim Malone. I'm a content strategist working with CIO Marketing Services, and I'll be your host and moderator for this webcast brought to you today by CIO and Kentik. We have two guests with us today to share their insights and expertise on this topic. So let's, without further ado, say hello to our guests. First up, let's say hello to Josh Mayfield, who's Senior Director of Product Marketing at Kentik. Josh, welcome. Thanks so much for being with us. Tell us a little bit about your role at Kentik.
I lead our product marketing and go-to-market efforts in trying to understand customers and how we can help solve some of their challenges, even the big, hairy, prickly, thorny problems, and doing that in conjunction with Chris when it comes to building great products that satisfy those needs.
Next, let's welcome Chris O'Brien, who's a product manager at Kentik. Chris, thanks so much for being with us. Tell us a little bit about your role at Kentik.
Yeah, I was a network engineer for about 10 years, and then I've been working on building software tools for network engineers for about another 12 years. And so I work with customers and development teams at Kentik to build Kentik NMS amongst other tools here.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Chris. Really happy you could be with us, and I'm looking forward to both yours and Josh's commentary today. Now, before we get started, I have a quick housekeeping tip. I want to point out the additional resources section of your player. There you'll find lots of helpful resources from our sponsor, Kentik, that you can download and share with colleagues, prospects, clients, etc. So we really recommend you take advantage there to do a really deep dive on today's topic. You can even download a copy of the presentation that we'll show during today's session. So please do take advantage of that. And finally, a big thanks to our sponsor, Kentik, for making today's event possible. We've got a lot of great material to cover, so let's get right to it. And to do that, Josh, I'm going to start with you. Let's think about getting that buy-in. So to optimize costs and build value, it's important to get that buy-in broadly across all the stakeholders. So in your experience, how can network teams identify the critical programs that depend on network integrity, monitoring, and observability? And really, why is that important?
That's the definition of a multi-part question there, right? So, you begin with the assumption, right, that you're going to need to get broad buy-in. Why is that? Once upon a time, right, you just put together your memo or your proposal, shoot it up the chain, and then you get some sort of approval. But it looks differently now when it comes to organizations, what solutions they might acquire, what projects they'll proceed with, what investments they'll make is much more democratized now. You really have to get this more cross-functional buy-in, and you have to do that at a different sort of level when it comes to more peer support and building a coalition of sorts, and just to get anything done, because there's going to have to be some bigger than me impact. It doesn't just make my job better or my discipline, let's say network engineering, better, but it helps the organization in these particular ways. And generally, yeah, the best thing to do is to identify the programs where are the budget dollars flowing. I think it was Willie Sutton, the old bank robber, that said when he was asked, "Why do you rob banks?" he said, "Because that's where the money is." And so there's a very practical aspect to this, because organizations are funding programs, not necessarily people or side projects or science experiments. What really gets funded, what gets attention, what gets OKR'd is the program. And so being able to map to the appropriate programs in that lateral way to get broad support rather than simply shooting up to the highest CXO you can is really an important part of understanding how am I going to get this thing that I want, this solution that I want. It's really going to come down to getting broad support and a coalition more so than executive fiat approval.
Yeah, and when I was a network engineer, I remember presenting both to our VP of IT, but as also the CFO. And initially that really surprised me. And so I asked why that was. And our VP of IT educated me that, IT expenses, when you've got a company that heavily uses IT expenses will be in like the top 4 or 5 of the biggest line items for the company. So typically, compensation for employees, rent for big buildings, maybe less so nowadays, but, and then IT is right up there. So it really deserves some due diligence. And due diligence means both from a technical perspective, and that's where I think we're used to thinking a lot, but also from the business perspective. And there's the goals of spending that money are basically never purely technical for the company. They're trying to achieve some company goal, and they express those goals largely through these programs. So figuring out which programs you're supporting and if you are supporting those is pivotal to providing the sort of value and contributing to the goals the business has, which is of course necessary if you want to get budget for these things.
Yeah. So lesson number one, to your point, is mapped to those programs. And I would encourage everyone here, like, create that chain of dependency. If your operation and what you're doing in infrastructure, operations, networking, engineering, architecture, if it were to vanish tomorrow, what programs are impacted? Which I know is everything, but what are those most significant areas of impact in the here and now, in budget cycles, in review cycles, in where investments are flowing in 2024?
Mm-hmm.
Being able to identify those and call out that chain of dependency is a key part of this.
Yeah, and trying to map the technical in there, what you're buying and getting from these projects is almost always in a couple of just different categories. So the first thing we probably think of is reliability. So how many nines are you looking for? Each nine is progressively substantially more expensive. So rather than saying, I want a network that is up 100% of the time, or 5 nines as a network engineer, that's kind of inappropriate, right? You have to figure out where the value is for the company because it's so expensive to meet those goals. So what I've done in the past is provide a little bit of a menu. It's like, here's the sort of cost it would have to open an office with an architecture that would get to 3 nines. Here's one that would get to 4 nines. Here's one. And that allows you to more negotiate with the business and make sure the dollars are matching the value there.
As we talk through this situation, it seems that we're asking network teams to be kind of their own best advocate. And I wanted to ask Josh and Chris, is this a leap for some of these network folks?
Yeah, it is a big leap for them. It's easy to be forgotten, which is one of the reasons I expressed it the way I did. If your function disappeared tomorrow, what happens? The whole thing falls apart. And to have that sort of responsibility, but lack of respect, oftentimes, it can challenge somebody to make that jump. And that's why I like Chris's advice of tying the practical outcome that the organization's looking for, a genuinely achievable result. And, you sort of have to come to them with the 1-3-1 model of, here's the one issue for your program. Here are the 3 things that the network could do, the network team, and the solutions that I'd offer you. And here's my one recommendation. I think we have to go to them on their particular terms, typically business terms, and making the case in that way. It's not a this or else, or even that fatalism that can sink in sometimes, but just being very practical. Here's what it is, here's what we could do, and here's what I would recommend. And I think you'll start to get people seeing things with that dependency, seeing just how dependent they are on you.
Josh, one of the interesting things we're seeing emerge with the network transformation is this move toward what we're calling a net DevOps strategy, borrowing from DevOps world, obviously, and for good reason. First of all, Josh, can you explain what net DevOps means in this context and what kind of programs are moving in that direction?
That's a very good question. We sort of glom on to different terms and buzzwords and so forth. This one is seemingly having some staying power over the last few years. It's really just migrating the concepts that we've taken from DevOps in the software engineering and development area and applying those to network and treating network in such a way, because a lot of it can be software defined. A lot of it looks like software implementation when you push to production, et cetera. And so how can we, apply these frameworks of CI, CD into network? The challenge is now we're getting into infrastructure stuff. So I know, Chris, you have opinions on this when it comes to it. There's more here than just, here, push this button and automate all those things you do. There's a reason there's sort of well, Chris, you have some commentary here. Sure.
Yeah. It's so, the first thing for me would be that there's a lot of hype around this, and it's hard to separate the hype from the reality. What I've seen good results from, and we're really fortunate that we get to see a lot of different organizations try and implement these strategies. And so that helps us get some perspective on these things that it would be impossible for me to get just working as a network engineer at one or a couple of companies. And one of the sort of thematically things that contributes to success is having this be incremental by nature, not trying to hard switch over to net DevOps, and paying more attention to the core concepts, driving reliability and workflow and uptime rather than any one practice. So keeping a loose hold on what those recommendations are, but a strong hold on the spirit of it, implementing changes and then observing their results, and then just building toward that, aspirational future.
Yeah, I really appreciate that when you said that the incrementalism, as a software program evolves and so forth, it's almost like each sprint is some sort of, I don't know, almost genetically, it's like the offspring, and it has, some of the same genetic things, but, there's some mutation that's happened along the way. But when you automate a little bit on the networking side, it can have more lasting impact, I guess you could say, or I should say more difficult to unwind, right? Potentially more concerning in that it's more like doing a genetic modification in a single generation, right? And jumping something into a whole species. And so I appreciate your point there around why, but here's the thing. Okay. So in practice, like Chris is saying, when it comes to net DevOps and the cautions, and also just, applying certain principles and so forth, mapping to initiatives, just as a pragmatic point here, what are people talking about? What are people saying that we're going to head off and do? And yeah, there's all those precautions along the way, but find those North Stars. Okay. Find that North Star where everyone's saying, hey, here's where we're going to go. And then you get to be the person that says, well, along the way, there's also going to be some swamps and some deserts and some crevices we're going to have to get through, but we'll get there, and we'll get there in this way. Right. But if you're an enabler of where they're already intending to go, where these North Stars are in your organization, then now you're an enabler and an empowerer of what they already want to do. And so you now get pulled along rather than trying to push against.
Yeah. And this is part of the soft skills that can make you way more effective as a network engineer. My place of comfort is in front of a terminal, not in front of people, but the soft skills side of it is invaluable. And really, in what you're saying, Josh, one of the tricks that I've used to great success in the past is just keep your ear out in the hallway. What are people getting excited about? What are people worried about? What are people having projects to go and complete? In terms of those specific initiatives, and then also in terms of even the vocabulary they use to talk about that thing. So, we all know as network engineers, if you hear someone talking about networking, you can immediately tell if they know what they're doing, because the vocabulary that experts use. And the same holds true with these initiatives. And it changes. Like there's that vocabulary for sort of business thinking or project management that is generic, but there's also what are the words that are the keywords in this organization today or this quarter. And if the more you can use those words, the more likely you are to be successful. This is not something perhaps that I wish was so, but it's definitely so.
Right. And that's what the title of this was, is getting what you want. So you want something. Okay, so how do we get it? Including potential things that muscles we haven't exercised before. But that's one way to do it. So even the things that are hyped up, and even the things that you might perceive as overhyped, there's still that's where the chatter is. And so being brought along to the things where investments are flowing, again, is a key part.
Yeah, there's two pieces of this, right? Like, the most important part is that you are thinking about your projects in a way that supports the company, the teams you are working with, working for, and what those goals are. There's the second part, which is more like positioning and how you communicate that effectively and persuasively. That is super important, or nothing's going to get done. But you can't miss the first one and only do the second one. That's just pure manipulation, right? You're trying to do what's right for the business and then convey that effectively.
Right.
Chris, networking's complex just by definition, and now the growth of data and devices has really made it even more so. So we think about what do we do with this complexity? One of the kind of knee-jerk reactions, let's automate. But you can't just, like Josh mentioned, you just can't push the automation button. So what are some of the tips that you can, or some of the advice and guidance you can give to listeners and viewers about building that solid foundation?
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can approach this. But what I have seen most frequently as sort of the big first chunk is establishing a network source of truth. Netbox is one of the most popular ones. They've really become very dominant in that field. But really, any system you use, it's super important to understand how the network should be working, and how your network looks. And the network source of truth provides that. And then all of your other systems can look to that as the authority. They can feed information to it. They can receive information from it. And so you have a sort of that common truth that you're working from. So I think that's the big step, the first really big step to take. But again, I think incrementing into it tends to be better. And maybe before I jump into that, a lot of organizations will get stuck half implementing a network source of truth. So it's way better to either implement a source of truth or not implement a source of truth. If you half implement a source of truth, the whole value of the thing is that the information is reliable. So if it's half the time right, then people won't use it as reliable information. Then it has no value. Then it's just kind of a time suck and a source of confusion. So I think when it comes to a source of truth, that's the big first step. And you want to move into that quite quickly and force yourself to get to completeness and usage of that thing for its purpose. Or, I mean, I would even go so far as to say, if you can't do that relatively quickly, and relatively quickly changes depending on the size of the organization. But if you can't do that relatively quickly, then you need to stop with network source of truth and maybe focus on other areas, other ways to start achieving automation.
Do you mind if I jump in there?
Go for it.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. When you're talking about all of the aspects, right? And there's different aspects of the network that other people and players might care more or less about. But if you have it all in this one big place of a source of truth that's accessible and meaningful, I think we might dare say, like being able to provide meaning and so forth, that you kind of went where I was going, which was the third one, which is mapping to people and players. So, and this is different than the program stuff, and initiatives and so forth. These now we're getting into humans, right, and what they care about, and it's one of those things to put a plan together that maps to a program, right? But it's inert. It's this hypothetical, abstract thing. But individual people, they can find meaning, and that was one of the things that when you're talking about a network source of truth, that's just where my mind went was. If you're going to build a coalition, what's the best way to do that? We'll find out what it means for them. And in doing so, that just where I went there. And so how can how can a network source of truth, right? That is accessible. You can ask any question of it, get to your answer. Like, what are the different types of players and people that you've seen in your career, Chris? I'm just curious that's impacted when there is this, maybe a halfway done job, but what's the intended group of people that's going to serve and be meaningful?
Yeah, the first level impact there is team. Basically you have your networking team, and then these people are much more aware of how the network exists, and when a change is made, they can all see it. And then you have peer groups. This would be like application teams, systems teams, to a lesser extent nowadays, database teams, all of these other teams that sit within IT, having those teams aligned with each other better and understanding, what is supposed to be true of the network better. And then going up, I think the more you go up, so director or VP of IT and so forth, it's proving out, number one, we understand our network and it is evolving and getting better every day. And then number two is that it is supporting the goals we have, right? So all of these things should, again, be oriented to the goals of the business. I would say mapping to people, what that makes me think of is as you're thinking about your first places to do automation, try to go simpler automation and think about sort of the intersection between simplicity of automation, the simpler the better, versus where are people spending the most time? What are my people spending 4 hours a day on? And so one of the explorations you can do is get your group together and say, what's taking the most time? How are you spending your hours? And try and find one of those that's a candidate for simple automation, or even coming up with a punch list, just going one or two at a time, not breaking off more than you can chew there.
Josh, unfortunately,
Yes.
Even the best strategy is going to fail without proper support and funding, as we've kind of discussed here. So how can network engineers and architecture teams communicate with their larger organizations to secure the budget for these critical projects?
That's a good question. How can you secure the budget? So far, we've talked about, map to programs, map to initiatives, map to people and players. Now there comes a point, and Chris and I were talking about this offline, there does come a point where you have to actually put some pen to paper or fingers to keyboard and make the plan. And so that was actually the lesson number 4, is that you can go and rally, and you can go and align of where your dependencies are. And you can even make the case with all those influential people and so forth. But if you don't have a plan, then that budget expectation, when you're planning ahead, okay, I've mapped everything now. To your question, how do I then secure budget? And sometimes I can't, and it can fail. Oftentimes it's because it wasn't a plan. There was the coalition, there was the dependency mapping, but there wasn't this plan of how it's going to get done. And so this is where we start to get very deep into the weeds, and we get specific, and maintaining all those points of connection. Like, here is my plan, and here's who it impacts. Here is my plan, and here's how it aligns. Here is my plan, and here's who it's going to influence and impact as individual parts and everything. And so if you don't have a plan of how you're going to realize what you've sort of imagined with everyone, I mean, up to this point, we've been imagining, hey, what if we could? And can't you see that? And we're starting to get almost like a political campaign, but we're starting to get people on our side. But then eventually the voters are going to say, but what is your plan? And so that's really that lesson 4, is make the plan and begin with the end in mind. I would strongly recommend what's the outcome you're looking for, which you've just done mapping steps 1, 2, 3, right? And then looking back, say, okay, what's my plan to get there? And budgets come in many forms. It's not just budget dollars, but budget time, budget people, budget labor, budget resources. Make sure that your budget, your plan is accounting for all of those things, and demonstrate that you've done your homework, that you've gotten your coalition, that you know the ticks and ties of what it's going to impact, and you have a plan of attack. That's going to get that belief in it and approval level much higher than just a bunch of voters on your side.
Yeah, when I think about a plan as a network engineer, I think about a technical plan. So I think about the target architecture we want to land it in a series of change controls that will get us there in a sort of measured, suitably aggressive, but risk mitigated way. And I think it would be helpful as sort of a mental model to think about that as a half or maybe even a third of what we're talking about here. So you have that technical plan, and that's incredibly important for the technical success. But this is also the time to collaborate with all of the key players after you've, identified them, as we saw in step 3. Collaborate with those key players to understand what's important to them, to sort of show them the initial look of what you're planning to do, to get their input and adjust your plan so that it is likely to be successful for them individually and their teams. And then as you present this, again, think of the technical pieces. I would, particularly in the presentation, maybe in the work layer, it's half, but in the presentation layer, it's more like a third. The technical piece is one piece, but things like timelines, people, impact to their processes, start and finish, how we're going to measure whether we have achieved the business's goals. Those should be, they may not be the majority of the work that you do on a day-to-day basis, but those are the main sort of processes and controls you want to use to make sure that plan achieves the goal you want. And if you communicate it like that, then you will be seen as a completely different person in terms of a network engineer. You're not a network engineer in a cave doing typing on a keyboard. You're someone who can map the organization's goals over to the latest and greatest technology, think about budgets, integrate that with the team, and drive those goals to successful conclusion. And that's where you want to be, not only to achieve big things in your organization, but certainly to find budget in the future that will set you up for success.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks,
I really like what you said about milestones too. Where you were talking about the milestones there. Very key point in your plan of showing what kind of progress I'm going to make by this date, and how that coalition you've been forming is going to be affected and participate in the plan that you're going for. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks, Josh. We've given the viewers here at least 4 steps so far. Now let's think about, what would you tell them if they wanted to know, what's something I can do tomorrow so I can get going, so I can get my network transformation really on the right track? What would you say to leave them to feel ready and, let's get going on my network transformation? Josh, let's start with you.
One of the things that we've been saying here is just, again, taking it as a given, is that the network is a core dependency of modern organizations, that without it, everything else vanishes, right? And so I think if that's the case you're going to make, right, then, which I guess I just mentioned, you're going to have to make a case, which is lesson number 5, by the way. You're going to have to make a case. And so if we're going to make the case of the dependency of the network, then an appraisal of that value is necessary. And the best way that I've seen that, when you're going to go make a case, is point 5, and boy, I can leave you with it, is quantify it, count, put numbers to things, but not numbers to the kinds of metrics and analyses that we do in network engineering and architecture and infrastructure management. Not those, but the metrics that all those folks in that coalition, all those key players and people, all those initiatives and programs, they have numbers to them. They have objectives beside them. They have OKRs. How can you change the number? How can you quantify what it is? And one thing, just to give you a framework that I would advise, is that when you're potentially struggling with that, think about it in 3 particular value zones, which is, I'm either going to be lowering costs in some way, I'm going to be increasing performance in some way, or I'm going to be lowering risk. And that's, again, business risk and business cost and business performance. Because you're tying to programs, you're tying to initiatives, you're tying to key people and players, right? So these are the business costs that go down, the performance of the business that goes up, or the risk in some way that I've mitigated or taken away. And again, that can be security risk in the cyber sense, or it can be just the risk of outage, the risk of failure to meet SLA, the risk of a particular geographic concern. There can be a lot of different risks that we're talking about. But if you're struggling to try to find, okay, what can I start to count? Think in those three areas. You will find numbers and you'll see how the network can impact it.
Yeah, and if I gave, a single tip as to how to get started on this tomorrow, it would definitely be that listen to what matters in your organization, what people are excited about, what they're trying to achieve, what they're worried about, and let that guide you toward all of these other steps.
Thanks so much to you both. We've been chatting with Josh Mayfield and Chris O'Brien with Kentik. Gentlemen, we have a few minutes left. I wanted first, before we have to sign off, to ask Josh if you can kind of summarize. We've given a really good kind of 5 pieces of really good advice for the viewers. Can you kind of wrap up and summarize what we've talked about here?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And so, in summary, okay, and there's a reason that this has challenges. This is your mission if you choose to accept it. Okay, so these are the challenges, but I know we can do it as network professionals. First, map to the so 3 maps and 2 makes. So we're going to map to programs, we're going to map to initiatives, we're going to map to the people and players, we're going to make a plan and make a case. And in so doing, I really think that you're 80% there. Then it just comes down to filling it in and paint by number when it comes to this project or this solution or this initiative that you're working on. Any number of those different things can fit that same framework of mapping to the appropriate things, making your case, and making your plan. And so that's what I would just leave folks with is as a quick summary, and I'm grateful that we got to go through it in more detail at each level. But if I can leave you with one thing, there's your screenshot, everyone. So go ahead and take it. But of course, the deck is available to everyone.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Josh. Now, before we go, I want to give both Josh and Chris a chance just to kind of leave us with a few key takeaways. So, Chris, let's do that. Let's start with you.
Yeah, I think for network engineers, this is not what comes natural. So it will take some intention and thought and practice. And so I would just say give yourself the space to try those things, to be a novice at it before you're an expert at it. But incrementally try those things. And one of the other great things you can do is just ask folks, how did that work for you? How did that conversation work for you? How do you think this project is going? And that will take you a lot further from the sort of more purely technical or mostly technical view into what do I need to be to work with the people around me effectively on these projects.
Thanks, Chris. And Josh, you're up. Key takeaways for our viewers today.
Yeah, I think the key takeaway that I'd like people to have is to recognize your value, is to recognize just how much you impact. And doing so with what I know is typically consistent of people in the networking profession is large loads of humility. And I'm certain that that's going to be the case. And in the most humble way, I think, is to just lead with the facts. And the fact is that every organization is network dependent. And so if you can just lay out those facts in that most humble way, in that of service sort of way, I think you can get started on these things. Just lay down the facts as they are. Diagrams are great. Draw the pictures, draw the objects and arrows, and you'll see where those dependencies are. And it's not, arrogant or lording it over anyone, but instead, just when you put it on paper, you'll see. You will in fact see just how necessary you are, and being able to really recognize your own value and demonstrate it to others.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Josh. Thanks, Chris. We are, in fact, at the end of our time for this session. Again, I want to give a big thanks to our speakers, Josh Mayfield and Chris O'Brien with Kentik. Thanks to you both for your expertise. Really powerful, powerful stuff. I think it's going to empower our audience here to make some of these changes and to get going on this transformation. And of course, a big thanks to Kentik for making today's event possible. Now, before we go, just a quick reminder, you can download today's presentation, along with lots of other great resources from our sponsors, so you can get going on your network transformation. So we do encourage you to do that. It's all available in the additional resources section. So please do take advantage of that. And with that, for Kentik and CIO Information Services, this is Jim Malone saying thanks everyone for tuning in.